Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Vice-Chancellor, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff McMullen. I'm the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Life and Health Sciences. And I'd like to welcome you here tonight for this memorial lecture entitled Vitamin D, A Delightful Story, to mark Julie Wallace's promotion to Professor. This is the last in the series of the University of Ulster Professorial Lectures for 2012. I'd like to, in particular, to extend a very special welcome to Julie's family who are with us tonight. Her husband Gordon, her lovely daughter Molly, mother Myrtle, brother Robert, and sister-in-law Rhonda, and all the other family members and friends who've been able to join us. We're really very grateful to them for giving us this opportunity to celebrate Julie's achievements and her contribution to niche biomedical sciences and the university in general. I know that Barbara and Sean and the rest of niche would also like to thank the university, the Vice-Chancellor and Head of School in Biomedical Sciences, Neville McLennan, for their support and encouragement also in holding tonight's event. In terms of the order of proceedings for tonight, in a moment I'll hand over to Sean Strain, Head of Niche, to make a tribute. Then Barbara Livingstone will introduce four speakers who were PhD students of Julie: Maria, Eamon, Valerie and Kirsty. And then Barbara herself will say some words. I'll then introduce Professor Sue Lanham-New, who will give a vote of thanks, and the proceedings will be closed by the Dean, Professor Carol Curran. Before I ask Sean to speak, I hope you won't mind if I say a few words about Julie. We're about to hear something of the excellent research that Julie was involved in. I think it's important and fitting to point out that this is the first time that someone was promoted to Professor from Senior Research Fellow, and the result of University of Ulster introducing a pathway by which our very best research staff can be recognised for the very significant contributions that they make to the university, and indeed the whole scientific and academic community. I joined the University of Ulster about 19 years ago and was very fortunate to join a faculty that had a lot of very young, enthusiastic and fun scientists. And Julie was one of those group of people. We would often bump into each other in the laboratories or in the senior common room over a cup of coffee. And it was always a pleasure to have a chat with Julie. I always found her to be a very positive person and so supportive of those around her. But I know that we will hear much more about this aspect of Julie as a person from those who worked most closely with her later on tonight. It's been a really amazing experience to see Life and Health Sciences at the University of Ulster expand, especially within biomedical sciences, from relatively humble beginnings to become one of the UK's leading research centres. And my colleagues in niche have been central to this development. And as we'll soon hear, Julie and the work that she was involved in significantly contributed to this success. We'll hear how special Julie was as a person and researcher, her achievements and the legacy that she's left with her students, colleagues in the research community. As a way of a very small example, I very recently gave a talk on behalf of the university to an audience of Department of Agriculture research scientists. And this conference was to celebrate the achievements of research within Northern Ireland. It'll be of no surprise to you to hear that the work of niche featured largely in my talk. However, two of the specific examples that were given that illustrated how niche does work that not only benefits the health of people in Northern Ireland, but also assists in helping the development of our economy by strengthening our agri-food industry, were projects that Julie was central to. I know it's a small sign, but it's a small sign of the significance of her work and its continuing impact. So I'd like to hand over now to Sean to say some words.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Vice-Chancellor, Julie's family, Gordon, Molly, Myrtle, Robert, Rhonda and Fran. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously this is a very sad occasion because Julie herself can't be here to deliver her own inaugural lecture. But I think it's also a very joyous occasion because we're here to celebrate the life and achievements of a great scientist. And I'm mindful that to many of us here tonight, She was more than a great scientist. She was a wonderful colleague. She was an exceptional mentor, a dear friend, and of course, a loving daughter, niece, sister, wife, and mother. I'd also like to second Jeff's comments and thank the university for facilitating this evening's celebration. Julie had many collaborators worldwide, and I'd just like to read two of the apologies sent. The first from Dr. Gary Myers, our senior collaborator at University of Rochester, New York. And this was an apology that he sent to Nish. I am so pleased that the school is honouring Julie in this way. Julie was an important and central colleague in the nutrition studies carried out in the Seychelles. We were all grateful for her commitment to the study and grew to appreciate her knowledge and professionalism and love for personality. She is certainly missed. This memorial professorial lecture is a wonderful way to honour our dear colleague and friend. I would love to join the celebration of her life and accomplishments, but unfortunately cannot. And from Dr. Conrad Shamla, who's the Chief Scientist of the Seychelles Ministry of Health, I'm sure that all the Seychellois join me in expressing our admiration for Julie's work and leadership. The Memorial Professorial Lecture is a wonderful tribute to a much respected and loved friend. Our best wishes to all our friends and colleagues in Ulster, and especially to the speakers. Professor Julie Wallace's primary education was at Pelagan National School, a small country one-teacher school in Donegal, which she attended from 1975 to 1983. Julie went to secondary school at Royal Empire Comprehensive School Raffo from 1983 to 1989. She then entered the BSc Honours programme in Biological Sciences at the University of Ulster, where she graduated with a first-class honours in 1992. Thereafter, she studied for a PhD, graduated in 1985, in nutritional immunology with Professor Billy Gilmore and me as her joint supervisors. I also had the pleasure of being Julie's line manager for her first postdoctoral position when she was employed through an EU grant. In 1999, she obtained her first research grant, and I was pleased to be a co-applicant with her on that application. Therefore, I was very well placed to observe Julie's transition from research student to an independent scientist of tremendous potential. Julie soon demonstrated this potential through her outstanding ability to attract external funding by obtaining a series of large grants. Her career earnings totaled over 6.8 million, which would place her among the very top external income earners at this university. Julie had some 60 peer-reviewed papers, many in high-quality journals, 14 reviews and over 100 abstracts. The most recent 4 papers and 2 reviews have been published since February 2012, and there are many other papers yet to be published where contributions as a co-author will be acknowledged. We have collated all of Julie's research publications to date, together with the evidence which was submitted for advancement to Professor. We would like to present a bound copy to Gordon and Molly, and one to Myrtle and Robert in her memory. The subject content of the papers reflects Julie's wide range of research interests and collaboration with various research groups within Nish and worldwide. Julie, however, is best known and remembered for her work on vitamin D research. She made this area of research very much her own, and she spawned numerous projects of which we will learn more tonight. Suffice it to say that we have been and still are following up numerous lines of research on vitamin D, which Julie initiated and which remains a fertile area for research income generation and quality research papers for others within Nish. So her legacy is fantastic. Julie was well known for her mentoring activities with early stage researchers and research students. She supervised or co-supervised a total of 16 research students to successful completion, many of whom are here tonight, and 4 are speaking. Julie also started the Journal Club within Nish, and with the primary purpose of mentoring early stage researchers. Julie has presented her work at home and abroad, and we'll hear more about her extensive collaborative networks worldwide. I've mentioned one of them already. Research in human nutrition, and indeed in most areas of science, is now very much a team activity, and Julie was a team player par excellence. As Jeff has already mentioned, although Julie was employed here in research track, She did her share of teaching, and by all accounts was an excellent teacher who was very much respected by undergraduate and postgraduate students alike. Julie also contributed to enterprise, obtaining significant income from industry through research and consultancy. Julie was a registered nutritionist and played a full role in professional activities within the discipline, having various tenures as the Honorary Treasurer of the Irish Section of the Nutrition Society, Chair of the Society for Chemical Industry Northern Ireland Section, and Secretary of the Ulster Immunology Group. Now I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Barbara Livingstone, who had a large part to play in organising tonight's memorial lecture. Barbara.
Thank you, Sean. Good evening. I would like to start by adding my own welcome to that of Jeff and Sean, and especially to welcome Julie Stanley. The title of this evening's lecture, Vitamin D, A Delightful Story, has been chosen to reflect Julie's research work and the primary focus of her work, as Sean has just said. I certainly don't intend to describe Julie's work or achievements in this area. That will be covered very capably by our four presenters. As Sean has indicated, all four are former PhD students of Julie, and include her very first PhD student, Valerie Holmes, and the most recent, Eamon Laird, who did an outstanding job of defending his thesis back in August. Sue was the external examiner. Julie would have been so proud of him. Of interest, all four have decided to follow in Julie's footsteps and make a career in research. Maria and Kirsty work here as research associates in Niche in Coleraine. Valerie is now a senior lecturer in the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Biomedical Science, Queen's University, Belfast, while our fledgling researcher, Eamon, is now making a name for himself in Trinity College, Dublin. Now, before we start, just to get a few items of housekeeping out of the way, in order for this lecture to run as seamlessly as possible, there will be no breaks between the presentations to introduce individual speakers. And in addition, in the interests of time, we won't take questions at the end. However, if you have any burning issues, questions, or whatever that you would like to raise with any of our speakers, they would be delighted to address these at the reception at the end of this lecture. So, Maria, can I ask you to start telling us the story of vitamin D? Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Barbara. As Barbara said, my name is Dr. Maria Mulher and I'm a research associate here at Niche. Currently I work on the Seychelles Child Development Study, but I also keep up with my vitamin D research as well. So I'm going to talk about the history of vitamin D. I was Julie's first PhD student to investigate vitamin D, to conduct vitamin D research here at Niche. Rickets is a debilitating bone disease characterised by softening of bones and bowing of legs. It was first reported in as far back as 1650, but it wasn't until 1921 that it was found that sun exposure was found to be a cure for rickets. And a year later, in 1922, vitamin D was isolated from cod liver oil, which was also found to be a cure for rickets. If we go to the local context, as far back as 1960, the importance of vitamin D in Northern Ireland was recognised for health. And this is an invoice from a Belfast linen mill from 1960. And it shows that vitamin D capsules were given to the linen workers. And since 1960, there's been a significant increase in the amount of publications in vitamin D research to the present day, resulting in over 30,000 peer-reviewed published papers. And even to the extent where nowadays we have downloadable apps where you can actually track your vitamin D synthesis from the sun and also your vitamin D intake from food. The classical role of vitamin D has been in bone metabolism through the stimulation of calcium absorption and mobilization, and thereby preventing rickets in children and osteomalacia and osteoporosis in adults. However, in recent years, the role of vitamin D in the whole human body have been discovered. Vitamin D is shown to decrease the risk of falls in elderly and improve lung function. Vitamin D has been associated with the incidence and progression of a number of cancers, autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis, inflammatory and infectious conditions, cognitive conditions, and cardiovascular disease. Vitamin D is actually a group of fat-soluble compounds ingested as either vitamin D2, also known as ergocalciferol, or vitamin D3, known as cholecalciferol. And the two main forms circulating in humans are 25-hydroxy-vitamin D, which is the status measure of vitamin D, and the hormonally active form of the vitamin 1,25-dihydroxy-vitamin D3. Vitamin D isn't by strict definition a vitamin because not only can we obtain it from the diet, but it can also be synthesised in the body through the skin. If we look at the natural sources of vitamin D, we have oily fish, eggs, liver and mushrooms. Fortified foods are becoming more increasingly popular and include cereals, margarines, milks and other foods such as yogurts and drinks. And vitamin D containing supplements are also popular. These are targeted primarily for those at risk of vitamin D deficiency. And we can see here that they're targeted towards pregnant women, which we'll hear more about from Valerie later, and also babies and young children. So whilst there are some dietary sources of vitamin D, these sources aren't widely used by the general population. So we can see that in terms of studies that have looked at vitamin D intake from the Republic of Ireland, we can see that mean daily intakes of vitamin D are lower than the recommended daily allowance, or the RDA, for both adults and the elderly. In the US, vitamin D intakes are slightly higher, and this might be owing to the increased availability of more fortified foods in America. However, we can still see that these are significantly lower than the RDAs for vitamin D in the US. If we go to the UK, we can see that in infants and the elderly, vitamin D intakes are lower than the RDAs for these age groups. And we can see that for children and adults, there's similar vitamin D intakes, but you'll notice here that there are no RDAs for individuals aged 4 to 64 years of age. And this is because it's generally assumed that we obtain enough vitamin D from sun exposure. Results from my own PhD, looking at vitamin D intakes in young adults aged 18 to 27, found very low intakes of vitamin D at 2 micrograms per day. So our main source of vitamin D is from sun exposure. When the skin is radiated by UVB rays from the sun, 70-hydrocholesterol in the skin is converted to vitamin D3 or cholecalciferol. Vitamin D3 from either diet or from the sun is hydroxylated in the liver to the status measure 25-hydroxy-vitamin D3. This is then further hydroxylated in the kidneys to the hormonally active form 1,25-dihydroxy-vitamin D3. And the amount of sun that we require is minimal. Around 10 to 15 minutes of midday sun on the hands, face and arms produces around 125 micrograms of vitamin D. And this is 50 times more than the dietary intake that we've seen in the previous slides. Excessive exposure to sun won't cause vitamin D toxicity because sunlight degrades excess vitamin D, plus as you tan, melanin decreases vitamin D synthesis. So, vitamin D synthesis in the skin is limited by a number of factors, and the most important of these are latitude and season. If we look at the blue line here, this is 0 degrees latitude, so it's around the equator. You can see maximal vitamin D synthesis compared to around the North Pole, which is the yellow line here, where there's little or no synthesis of vitamin D. If we look at Northern Ireland, which is at a latitude of 55 degrees north, we're somewhere in between here. If I orientate you to the bottom of the slide, this is the months of the year from January to December. At the equator, so not degrees latitude, there's little seasonal variation in vitamin D synthesis. And around the North Pole, we can see poor old Santa doesn't get much time to produce much vitamin D, just from May to September. And as again, Northern Ireland, we're in between, we can make vitamin D for around 6 months of the year during the summertime. Vitamin D is also, the synthesis of vitamin D is also limited by weather, so even when we do have our 6 months of the year where we can synthesize vitamin D, we're limited by another number of other factors. We all know what the weather's like here in Northern Ireland, so this is the open Gulf. Jeff would know a lot about that. So even cloud cover can reduce our ability to synthesize vitamin D. And even whenever it rains, we tend to be covered up in raincoats and under umbrellas. Sunscreen also reduces the synthesis of vitamin D, and a sun protection factor of 8 reduces vitamin D synthesis by 95%. Skin colour, societal factors such as the wearing of veils and increasing age also reduce our ability to synthesize vitamin D. And the amount of fat that we have in our body also impedes on our ability to synthesize and store vitamin D. And Kirsty will talk more about this later. So what does this mean in terms of our vitamin D status? We have low dietary intakes and we have a number of factors that affect our skin synthesis. If we look at studies that have looked at vitamin D status, and this is the mean 25-hydroxy vitamin D concentration, this is a study conducted in the Republic of Ireland in adults, found that the mean vitamin D status was 60 nanomoles per litre, with around 40% of individuals classified as vitamin D insufficient. In this slide, when I talk about vitamin D insufficiency, I'm talking about vitamin D status less than 50 nanomoles per litre. Now there is controversy over what level is defined as insufficiency and deficiency, and Eamon will talk about this later. If we look at the UK, between 35 and 70% of individuals are classified as vitamin D insufficient. Because of the increased availability of fortified foods, the amount of vitamin D insufficiency is slightly lower in the US at around 25 to 50%. Julie was heavily involved in a study, which was a longitudinal study involving adolescent boys and girls, and it was called the Young Heart Study. And recent work by Dr. Hill found that 38% of adolescent boys and 55% of adolescent girls in the Young Heart Study were vitamin D insufficient. Work conducted as part of my PhD found that 50% of young adults aged 18 to 27 years were classified as vitamin D insufficient. During my PhD, Julie also decided that it would be good to look at vitamin D status of patient groups, and at that time multiple sclerosis and the link with vitamin D was quite topical. So we decided to recruit a group of multiple sclerosis patients and healthy controls and look at the differences in vitamin D metabolism between them. And we found that 38% of our MS patients were indeed vitamin D insufficient. So we know that we have problems with status, and we know that our dietary intakes are low. So Julie applied for funding for a significant amount of money from the Food Standards Agency to carry out a collaborative study with the University College Cork, and we call this the FSA study. You'll hear lots about that. So this was to look at the dietary requirements for vitamin D, and it was an investigation of the significance of both dietary intake and sunlight on vitamin D status. So what we did was we conducted a large randomised placebo-controlled intervention study, and this is the gold standard for conducting clinical trials or nutrition intervention studies. In 2006, we recruited 240 adults aged 20 to 40 years. Half were recruited here in Ulster and half were recruited in Cork. During the summer, we looked at UV exposure of these individuals using a sun badge which they wore on their shoulder, and also by questionnaire. At the end of summer, which was October, November, we took a blood sample, a baseline blood sample, to assess vitamin D status. The individuals were then randomised to receive either placebo, 5, 10 or 15 micrograms of vitamin D3 per day for 6 months during the wintertime period. And then at the end of winter, at March, when vitamin D status should be at its lowest, we took another blood sample. So this was our post-intervention blood sample. The following year we conducted exactly the same study, but this time we looked at adults who were 64 years and older. So I'll just take you through this slide. On the bottom we have the treatment group, so we have the placebo, the 5, the 10 and the 15 micrograms of vitamin D per day during the winter time. And along the y-axis we have the 25 hydroxy vitamin D concentration, your vitamin D status. The green bars represent pre-status, so the end of winter, and the blue bars represent the end of summer, and the blue bars represent post-intervention, which was the end of winter. We can see that at the end of summer, all the green bars are above this line of vitamin D sufficiency, greater than 50 nanomoles per litre. During the winter, in the placebo group, we saw a significant decline in vitamin D status over the wintertime period, and these were to levels of insufficiency, and this is what we expected to see over the wintertime. In the treatment groups, we saw dose-dependent maintenance of vitamin D status over the wintertime, and so it meant that it kept levels within vitamin D status within levels of sufficiency. We also found from this work that the amount of vitamin D needed to prevent deficiency depended on the amount of sun that you were exposed to. So in individuals who enjoyed exposure to sun required 7.2 micrograms per day of vitamin D to maintain status for the winter time, and this went up to 12.3 micrograms per day in those individuals who avoided sun. I've presented some of the results here from the young adults cohort, but we also found similar results in the older adults cohort. Julie then went on, in collaboration with her colleagues in Cork, to obtain more funding to look at the blood samples from the FSA study. We call this FSA2. And we looked at vitamin D and associated health outcomes. And we found that maintaining vitamin D status with supplementation over the wintertime did not affect bone turnover, immune function, or cardiovascular health. However, despite supplementation with up to 15 micrograms per day, the mean vitamin D status over wintertime was only 69 nanomoles per litre, and these are levels below those thought to be optimum. I'm going to pass on to Eamon now because he's going to talk about the controversies dealing with vitamin D sufficiency and insufficiency.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Eamon Laird. Tonight I'll be talking about vitamin D, optimising the method. So vitamin D status cutoffs. So it's measured by the concentration of 25 hydroxy vitamin D, the metabolite measure in the body. And deficiency is defined as less than 25 nanomoles per litre. Now deficiency is, well, if you're deficient in vitamin D, you have increased risk of osteoporosis and chronic disease. Insufficiency is defined as 25 to 50 nanomoles per litre. Of insufficiency over a long period of time, there's increased risk of chronic disease development. And 50 nanomoles per litre is defined as sufficient. Now these are the IOM guideline cutoffs, Institute of Medicine in America. And there's a lot of controversy of these cutoffs at the moment. A lot of people suggest maybe greater than 75 or even greater than 100 nanomoles per litre is needed for sufficient vitamin D status. And currently within the UK at the minute, there's a scientific advisory committee on nutrition for vitamin D, and they're deciding on what our vitamin D requirements are going to be in the future in the UK and Ireland hopefully. And so you can see here, Professor Sunu is actually on the committee and she's speaking tonight. Yeah, and these are actual people who are going to decide how much we need in the future. So is there a U-shaped curve of vitamin D? Why are all these cutoffs important? Well, recent evidence has suggested that below 50 nanomoles per litre there's an increased risk of disease, and as you increase in concentration to 50 to 100 nanomoles per litre, there's sort of a dip in the curve. This is sort of the sweet spot of vitamin D. As you increase vitamin D concentration greater than 100 nanomoles per litre, there's an increased risk of disease. So more isn't always better in terms of vitamin D. So all of this is dependent on accurate measurement of 25-hydroxyvitamin D concentration within the body. So how do we measure vitamin D? Well, apologies for this, I know it's a bit sort of gooey, you don't always see somebody's needle sticking into an arm, but this is how we do it. This is how you actually measure vitamin D. It's an invasive method. So you get the blood sample from a person, you put it into a tube. Next you put it into this machine called centrifuge, you spin it down, and what you get is your serum or plasma separated from the blood. And after you take it from the centrifuge, you remove the serum and plasma and you put it into something called aliquots, and label these up and you put them into a box so you can either freeze them or measure them directly. So measuring the sample, this is probably the hardest bit of actually the whole process. And there's a variety of different methods out there. One is ELISA, or another is LCMS, MS, liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry. It's most commonly used. However, not all labs use the same method. So ELISA, so it's a sensitive immunoassay. It measures an enzyme linked to an antibody or an antigen as a marker for the detection of a product, i.e. vitamin D. So if you look at this plate, it's an 86-well plate. The darker the colour, the more concentrated, the higher the vitamin D concentration. So this person here, very, very dark colour, very high vitamin D concentration compared to somebody up here, very, very light. So ELISA, what you get is an ELISA kit. This is what it looks like here when you open the box. You add your vitamin D from the blood sample, you put it under this very, very strong light, it shines through it, and this machine here measures the absorption of light through the antibody. So LCMS-MS is an analytical technique that measures the mass-charge ratio of particles and is used to determine the masses of particles and for measuring the amount of compound in a sample, i.e. vitamin D. So this is LCMS-MS around 1918, looks like sort of a mad scientist time machine. But if you go to the future, 2012, this is what it is now at the minute. It's very unique, so very high accurate machine. This bit here is where the actual sample goes through these wires here and into this big machine here. So how it works, so the sample goes in through these wires here, gets really heated up, super high temperatures, and shot along here, and what you get is this result here. So this is a chromatogram. So in every sample we have an internal standard that comes out so we know it's actually working. And this little green peak here is vitamin D3. This tiny red peak here is vitamin D2. So in a comparison study with part of my PhD, I looked at ELISA versus LCMS. Julie is very keen, very instrumental in getting the LCMS technique set up in Coleraine. It was the best method it is out there at the minute. And lucky enough for me, I was able to transfer the method from James's Hospital in Dublin, where I was in placement as part of my PhD. I was able to transfer it successfully up here to Coleraine. Now, it just wasn't as easy bringing it up from one end, from one bit of the country to another. It did take about 3 or 4 months to get it going, and Julie was very instrumental in helping me get it set up. I would go to her and I'd say to her, it's not working. She'd just keep telling me, keep going. Eventually, we done it, and we got it going. So as part of my PhD, as you heard from Maria, I was looking at samples from the FSA study, and these were measured by ELISA in 2008, and I reanalyzed them again using the LCMS in 2011. So what we got is 2 different results. So this is vitamin D status according to the method used. So the blue is the LCMS and the green is ELISA. So if we look at deficiency, we can see here with ELISA, less people are actually defined as deficient compared to LCMS. And if we look at sufficiency, we can see nearly 60% of people are actually defined as sufficient compared to only 50% by LCMS. So what it means is a high level of variability between labs and different methods. For example, one lab A may have your result could be 35 nanomoles per litre. The next lab could be 51 nanomoles per litre. So you're insufficient by one lab, but you're sufficient according to another. And it's not just ELISA versus LCMS, it's similar for all methods, HPLC, radioimmunoassay. So why does this all matter? Well, again, if you go back to the graph, if one method's saying you're between 50 and 100, another method's saying you're less than 50, there's a big difference between your risk of disease. So it's important to have an accurate measurement for the vitamin. So as another part of my PhD, I was involved in the Seychelles Child Development Study, reanalyzing or actually measuring vitamin D samples. Now, this was a large collaborative study with New York, the University of Rochester, and Julie was very instrumental in setting it up. And it was an investigation of a pregnant woman in the Seychelles and investigating mercury exposure, fish consumption, and cognitive outcomes. Now, you can see here coloring this typical picture. Doesn't matter if it's summer or the winter time, but it's always the same. And this is Seychelles, it's a tropical paradise compared to what we're used to. So samples, there was 280 samples at enrollment, 28 gestational weeks. We had delivery and we had a cord sample. So this is vitamin D concentration across pregnancy. So you can see here, they're well above the deficiency. And most of them are actually above the 15 nanomoles per litre. Most of them are actually between 75 and 100 nanomoles per litre. The medium, this line here, never really goes above this sort of magic number of 100 nanomoles per litre. So you can see there's a high degree of sufficiency across this population, as you would expect in a sun-rich country. And another little thing we done was vitamin D delivery concentration, yes, birth length and birth weight. As you can see here, there's a significant correlation between vitamin D and length of the baby and actual birth weight. So the higher the vitamin D, the bigger the baby and the heavier the baby will be. And this is controlled for age, height, BMI, smoking, alcohol, and the gestational age of the baby. And I'll just hand over to Valerie, who'll be talking about pregnancy at our altitude, which not as you expect won't be as great as these people here.
Good evening. My name is Valerie Holmes and I was a PhD student with Julie between 1999 and 2002. I was the first of Julie's PhD students to graduate, and indeed it's almost 10 years to the day since we graduated. I graduated in the Millennium Forum with Julie, and we had a wonderful day, and we had the pleasure of having our photograph in the Belfast Telegraph the next day. My PhD was before the vitamin D work that Julie was involved in, and it was entitled Early Markers of Hemostasis in Pregnancy. And the conclusion and hypothesis of that really was that normal, healthy pregnancy is very much a balancing act, and that a lot of the biomarkers or the markers that are in our blood are very finely tuned and finely balanced, and that a disruption in any of those markers may cause an adverse event, such as a blood clot or venous thromboembolism. Some years after I finished my PhD and I was a lecturer in Queen's University, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Julie again and with Maria. And we were very interested, given Julie's work in vitamin D, in looking at vitamin D status within the cohort that I had worked up on during my PhD. And over the next few minutes, I'd just like to share with you the work that we did and show you how the current evidence suggests that there may also be very much a balance in terms of vitamin D status during pregnancy. Vitamin D status in pregnancy, and that is the status of the mother during pregnancy, has been associated with infectious diseases, also some association with preeclampsia, gestational diabetes and caesarean section. And although a lot of this work is currently observational and we're waiting for the results of large randomised controlled trials, there is an increasing amount of publications linking vitamin D status with maternal outcomes. And also when we think of the offspring, there are some studies showing that low vitamin D status is associated with impaired growth, type 1 diabetes, asthma, schizophrenia. And again, further research is required really to show that this vitamin D is causality, but the observational studies have shown some evidence of a linkage. You've seen this slide earlier from Eamon, and it's really describing the U-shaped relationship. And this is the same evidence suggests for the mother and the maternal vitamin D status, in that there is risk of disease in the low vitamin D status, as we showed in the last slide. And now evidence suggests that fetal growth and schizophrenia, the higher doses of levels of vitamin D, so higher vitamin D status, may also cause increased risk. So there is a balance to be had in terms of vitamin D status within pregnancy. So what are the recommendations for vitamin D supplementation in pregnancy? Well, current NICE guidelines, as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, recommend that pregnant women are advised of the benefits of taking vitamin D supplements when they first attend for their booking visit. And they're advised to take 10 micrograms of vitamin D per day, and healthcare professionals are really recommended to check that high-risk women are taking those vitamin D supplements. And those women who are at high risk of vitamin D deficiency are women who are highly pigmented or veiled. And there's a lot of research in this area, and up to 70% of women who are veiled or highly pigmented have been shown to be vitamin D deficient. At the time of our collaboration, there were a few studies looking at vitamin D status in pregnant women from European or Caucasian backgrounds living in northern latitudes. There was a study in Southampton which showed that 18% of pregnant women, were deficient in vitamin D status. And then another study in Cork by O'Riordan et al. Showed 24% deficiency. So we were interested to look in the sample that we had carried out from a PhD at vitamin D status. And so we had samples from 99 pregnant women, and we had those at 12 weeks gestation, which is the first trimester, and those were sampled in the winter. We had some at 20 weeks gestation, and those were from the springtime, and 35 weeks gestation. We also had a small number of samples post-delivery. There was also a control group of non-pregnant women who were sampled at the same time so that we were able to control for seasonal variation. Plasma vitamin D status was measured via the ELISA method, and we had notation from all women on whether or not women were taking a multivitamin supplement at the time of blood sampling. So in terms of the study population, our pregnant women and our non-pregnant control group were very similar in terms of their age, BMI, their smoking status, and reporting multivitamin use. And the multivitamins that the women consumed tended to contain between 5 and 12.5 micrograms of vitamin D. So if we look at this slide, we can see that the vitamin D status, or the 25-OHD concentration in pregnant and non-pregnant women, was significantly higher in our non-pregnant women. And so if I orientate you to the slide, we have our 25-OHD concentration or vitamin D status along here. Here we have the 3 time points, 12 weeks, 20 weeks, 35 weeks, and post-delivery. The green boxes are our pregnant women, the blue are non-pregnant controls. And we can see at 20 weeks, 35 weeks gestation, and then later on post-delivery, our pregnant women have significantly lower vitamin D status than their non-pregnant controls. In the winter, both groups have very low vitamin D status. If we just bring these lines onto the graph just to mark out where deficiency is, red line and below, and the green line is sufficiency, so we're sufficient, green line and above, we can see that in the winter very few are reaching sufficiency, and as we go through, we are seeing that our non-pregnant controls are quite sufficient in summer and autumn. Our pregnant women remain in this insufficient level. So if I move that on to look at percentages in terms of the cut-offs and our pregnant women, and if we look here at the less than 25 in the red box, these are the women who are deficient. We can see, that in winter 35% of our pregnant population are deficient in vitamin D. In the spring, so well after the winter is gone, no sunshine for some time, 44% are deficient in vitamin D. And even in the summer, we have 16% deficient. If we then look at those who are insufficient and deficient, so cumulative, we see that 96% of our pregnant population are either deficient or insufficient in winter and spring. And in the summer, still 75% were insufficient or deficient. And so during winter and spring, only 4% of our pregnant population here had sufficient vitamin D. While not a randomised control trial, and this was observational data that we had, we felt it would be interesting to look at those who were taking a supplement and those who were not, and see what impact that had on the vitamin D status. 25% of our pregnant women reported taking multivitamin at the time of blood sampling. And we can see here supplement use are in the bluey purple, and those not taking a supplement are in the pink. And what we found was that women who were taking a vitamin D supplement had significantly higher vitamin D than those who did not. And when we looked in terms of vitamin D deficiency below the red line and vitamin D sufficiency above the green line, we can see that taking a vitamin D supplement really did keep our women above the deficiency line. But it was only in summer that the pregnant women were able to come above the sufficient line in terms of vitamin D status. And this was where supplements vary between 5 and 12.5 micrograms of vitamin D. And so there's more work to be done in terms of finding what the optimal dose is for pregnant women, particularly living at this latitude, in terms of maintaining their vitamin D status to the optimal or if even sufficient level. So 54 to 55 degrees north, we are in the dark. And this is a slide taken from the Met Office which shows our average value and hours of sunshine. It's obviously better to live nearer the coast, and we can see that the highest average values in terms of our hours of sunshine are 1,400 to 1,600 hours. If we just move to Southampton, which is not a million miles away, slightly further south, we can see that along the coast they have 1,750 to 1,900 average hours of sunshine, and that our highest is their lowest in terms of average hours of sunshine. And I just want to finish on this slide and just bring the story together in terms of vitamin D status in pregnancy and the latitude at which we live. And these are the studies that Julie was involved in from Belfast and the Seychelles at the start and the finish of this graph. And we can see that 44% of our women here in Northern Ireland were deficient in vitamin D after the winter. As you move south to Cork, some fewer. Southampton, a little bit better. Belgium, fewer women again deficient. And if you go to the Seychelles, as Eamon alluded to, we have no pregnant women with vitamin D deficiency. And so this work really highlights that perhaps living at a northern latitude is another risk factor for low vitamin D status in pregnancy. I would like to introduce you now to Kirsty, who is going to talk about vitamin D. Does one size fit all?
Okay, good evening everybody. So as Valerie said, I'm going to take it a stage further from the pregnancy and look at a couple of other at-risk groups in terms of vitamin D status. So first of all, my PhD was in the area of obesity and body composition, and within this then Julie thought this would be an ideal opportunity to investigate vitamin D status. Within the literature, obesity was fast becoming another risk factor for low vitamin D status, and indeed a low status was increasingly reported in those with a high BMI, a high body mass index, so more body fat. Reasons for this, although they're still quite debated within the literature, is thought that those with a higher BMI or the more obese individuals perhaps have less mobility. Whenever they go outdoors, they maybe cover up more, wearing less clothing, so both of these contributing to a reduced sun exposure. But as Maria alluded to earlier, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, so it's stored within our fat tissue in our bodies. And it's thought that although the obese individual can maybe synthesise the same amount of vitamin D, that this somehow is becoming trapped in the fat tissue and isn't then released into the circulation for use. But as I say, a lot of these still have question marks within the literature around them. Further on from this, an increasing BMI, so those, as your BMI was increasing, the research was suggesting that this would actually reduce the change in vitamin D status following supplementation. And although the evidence was building, a lot of the research coming out mostly focused on the morbidly obese populations, or those undergoing gastric surgery, for example, and also didn't account for seasonality, which, as you will have heard already this evening, is a very important factor in vitamin D status. So as part of my PhD, I started off working on the FSA study that Maria has introduced this evening. And we used this as an ideal opportunity to investigate links between vitamin D status and body fat in a well-controlled placebo-controlled intervention study. So just to take you through the results then, at baseline, within the elderly adults, we did in fact see the same relationship in that there was a lower vitamin D status in those with both a higher BMI and a higher body fat. So those heavier individuals were more at risk of having a low vitamin D status. And just to remind you that these samples were taken at the end of summer when we would expect vitamin D status to be at its highest. Post-intervention then, so after a period of supplementation over the winter months, increasing BMI was shown to reduce the change in vitamin D status, again, as has been reported previously within the literature. And this is shown here on the right-hand side of this graph. So those taking the 15 micrograms of vitamin D3, the heavier individuals, those in the darkest grey bars, had less of a change to supplementation. What was also interesting from this study is that in the placebo group, so those that were given the dummy pill over the winter months, although the obese individuals were starting off at a lower status, they actually had less of a change. So somehow their bodies knew that they were starting off in a worse position and held on to the stores better. These results that I've presented here are from the elderly adults, and in fact we did the same analysis in the younger adults that were done the previous year, but in fact saw no significant relationships between vitamin D status and body fat in this cohort. And one reason we thought this may have been it's down to the changes with ageing. So unfortunately, as we age, our body fat increases with a slow decline in lean muscle mass. So overall our body weight is increasing as we get older. And in fact what happens with the skin's capacity to reduce or to produce vitamin D3 is in fact this also decreases with age. So if it's at 100% whenever we're a young adult, by the time we reach around 70 years of age, it's down to about 50%. So the reason we saw this important relationship between vitamin D status and body fat in the older adults is possibly because we thought that it was only coming into play whenever the two lines were coming closer together. So following on then from my PhD, a lot of evidence was accumulating again in the literature, looking at the vitamin D in elite athletes, and whether this was down to Olympic fever starting to take hold, but also the fact that vitamin D deficiency, as we've heard, was not only being related to the skeletal or bone health outcomes, but also a number of other non-skeletal benefits, which may ultimately impair athletic performance. And a number of studies also were showing that athletes themselves, no different to the general population that we've already heard tonight, worldwide athletes had an insufficient vitamin D status of that less than 50. And in fact, to address just one size fit all, there is literature to suggest that athletes do in fact or may need higher levels, so upwards of 50, reach that their sufficient vitamin D status may need to be 75 to 80 nanomoles per litre in order for them to see benefits. So directly after my PhD, which I think emerged over a coffee between Julie and Pamela, an opportunity arose for us to work with 3 groups of elite Irish athletes. And I remember the day Julie came in and asked would I mind taking a few blood samples down in Belfast. for a master's project, and I said, yeah, no problem. It turned out to be a wee bit more than this, but in fact a very, very enjoyable experience. So this is just a few of the athletes that we worked with, pictured with some of the MSc students. So mainly there was the Irish boxers here, and then the Paralympians, the Irish Paralympians. And we also had a team of GAA players or Gaelic players. So overall, when we looked at vitamin D status in this group, about half of the athletes that we sampled were vitamin D insufficient or deficient. But what was interesting about this study is it was actually carried out at a couple of different time points. So the first two groups, the boxers and the Paralympians, were sampled at the end of winter, at the end of summer. So when we would expect vitamin D status to be at its highest. And while the green bars looked promising, there was still a third of these athletes that were still vitamin D insufficient or deficient at this time point. Then, following the winter months, we had the opportunity to sample the third group of athletes, who were the Gaelic players, and you'll see that the levels of insufficiency and deficiency dramatically increased, and in fact, about 96% at this time, at the end of winter, were vitamin D insufficient or deficient. So as part of this work, it was a collaboration with the Irish Institute of Sport. We had the opportunity to provide wintertime vitamin D supplementation to the boxers and Paralympic athletes in order to try and improve and maintain their vitamin D status. And in fact, this was successful in that all of these insufficient and deficient vitamin D statuses were in fact corrected with wintertime supplementation. And as such, the Irish Institute of Sport have adopted this as a protocol for all athletes over the wintertime following the results of this work. So we've heard throughout this evening that there seems to be a problem with vitamin D status in the population. We've limited sources of dietary vitamin D and limited opportunities to synthesise this from the sun. So the question was posed, is there any other way of increasing our dietary intake without resorting to supplements? So the most obvious then is food fortification, the consumption of foods with higher vitamin D or added vitamin D concentrations. And one of the most recent projects that I'm delighted to be able to tell you about tonight that Julie was involved in, and Jeff has already alluded to, was that Julie was successful in securing a collaborative project between the Dairy Council for Northern Ireland and AFBI, the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute, in which we wanted to look at the vitamin D in cow's milk. So this project has literally just started in the last few months, and we aim to investigate the vitamin D content of milk within Northern Ireland, and this hasn't been looked at since the late 80s. Then we want to look at how this can be improved, so both on-farm methods and also at the production level, and ultimately how this will impact consumers not only in Northern Ireland but further afield. So just to try and summarise all the work we've heard tonight, I think you'll agree with me in that we've seen a range of research covering the entire life cycle of the population, and also a number of different diseases and conditions. And Julie's research just didn't have an impact locally to this population or to those suffering these conditions. But in fact, the most notable impact of Julie's research is that the FSA studies that you've heard about throughout this evening have recently been used by scientists in the US for the revision of their dietary guidelines. So just towards the end of 2010, these new dietary guidelines were published that used the two FSA studies as evidence to inform the new dietary guidelines. So tonight the four of us have just given you a very, very brief overview of Julie's work in vitamin D. And indeed it wasn't her only area of research. She was involved in a number of areas of research, including vitamin D, and one of the aspects I know she enjoyed the most was the number of collaborations worldwide that she was able to secure as part of this research. And I would just like to finish on this by saying that the four of us this evening have been honoured to deliver this lecture.
Thank you.
Didn't you train them well? Please don't underestimate the time, the effort and the emotion that our speakers have invested in their presentations this evening. Their overriding concern, as you have heard, is to do Julie proud. And of course, they're also very much aware that Julie would have expected no less than their best performance this evening. While vitamin D was Julie's primary research area, in fact, she was unique in having the broadest research portfolio of any member of staff in niche. For example, she worked closely with me in obesity research. She worked with Emer McSorley in immunology research, and with Helen McNulty and Mary Ward in the B vitamin research. Indeed, she was so good at freelancing that she often referred to herself as the niche tart. Her words, not mine. It's very easy to understand why her inputs into these research areas were so valued, and I'm coming to that now. So what is Julie's legacy for those of us who've had the privilege and pleasure of working with her? Without a shadow of a doubt, as far as I'm concerned, the most important part of her work legacy is the one that she leaves to all of our young and aspiring researchers. First and foremost, Julie expected and maintained the highest possible standards of personal and scientific integrity in all aspects of her work. And of course, by default, she also expected the same standards from those that she mentored, supervised, and worked with. She was never precious about her research. Rather, she was always inclusive and generous with sharing her thoughts and ideas. She encouraged her students to push themselves beyond their comfort zone, while at the same time remaining true to themselves. As any of her PhD students will confirm, this did mean a load of hard work. But they will also agree that the rewards of working with her far outweighed anything else. She was an outstanding mentor, not only to students, but to her colleagues as well. Julie just didn't inspire the young researchers. I would have to say that many of us not so young researchers learnt a thing or two from her as well. As colleagues, co-investigators and co-authors of her research, we all benefited from her keen scientific mind, her eye for detail, and her insightful questioning, which was always constructive and almost invariably highly pertinent. For all of our young researchers, if her legacy becomes your template, you will have paid Professor Wallace the finest tribute possible. Undoubtedly, Julie loved her work, but she did not live for her work. And I dare say many of us could learn a lesson or two about her very balanced perspective on work and life outside work. Julie's life outside work was firmly focused around her beloved family. Those of us privileged to have been able to count her as a friend will remember with affection all the fun and the laughs we shared. I'm going to share one of them with you. As many of you are aware, our Julie was not averse to a spot of retail therapy. Now don't get me wrong, she wasn't high maintenance, but she did have a very good eye for what suited her in clothing and all the accoutrements that go with them, particularly the handbags. Unfortunately, for any of us who happened to be with her on these outings, she also had a very good eye for what suited us as well. And when you couple that with subtle and sometimes not so subtle powers of persuasion. You're all fairly intelligent people. You don't have to tell me or tell me to tell you what happened next. Having said that, by her own admission, she never did enjoy a 100% success rate in sorting me out as regards the wardrobe. But I have to hand it to her, she never gave up trying. Just one of many special memories. Indeed, each one of us here this evening will have our own unique memories of Julie. There's one factor that links all of those memories. It's why we are here this evening, and it's why those who cannot be here wish they were here. Julie was a very special person who has added value to all of our lives. Julie is sorely missed by us all, but it's fitting that she has the final say. In her own very pragmatic words, I know she would tell us to just get on with it. Words many of us will be familiar with. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'd like to now invite Professor Sue Lanham-New to give the vote of thanks. Professor Lanham-New, or Sue as she is known to everyone in nutrition at Coleraine, is Professor of Nutrition and currently Head of Department of Nutrition and Metabolism at the University of Surrey. She has been an academic member of staff within the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at the University of Surrey since 1996, having previously worked and studied at the University of Aberdeen and the Rowett Research Institute in Scotland. Her research focuses on the area of nutrition and bone health, for which she has won a number of awards, including 3 Young Investigator Awards at the World, UK and European Osteoporosis Conferences, as well as the 2001 Nutrition Society Medal for her work on the role of the skeleton in acid-base homeostasis. She's Editor-in-Chief of the Nutrition Society textbook series and a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, as Eamon showed us earlier on, and also the SACN Vitamin D Working Group. She's co-editor of the first academic textbook on nutritional aspects of bone health, published by the Royal Society of Chemistry, which has sold over 1,000 copies and raised more than £5,000 for the National Osteoporosis Society. She has published more than 95 peer-reviewed original papers, book chapters and reviews, and raised more than £4 million in research grants. She has 9 students who have successfully completed their PhD, and a further 8 students in active PhD study. She's on the editorial board of Osteoporosis International and Osteoporosis Review, and she's a member of the Nutrition Forum for the National Osteoporosis Society and the Scientific Advisory Group of the British Nutrition Foundation and the BNF Task Force on Ageing, and was Honorary Communications Officer of the UK Nutrition Society from 2000 to 2006. Sue has a long association with nutrition at the University of Ulster in her capacity as external examiner of a variety of undergraduate and postgraduate degrees between 2004 and 2008. She's been a long-term advocate of the nutrition work, both teaching and research, carried out in Ulster, and I'm told readily and frequently sings our praises throughout the nutrition community. Sue returns to Coleraine regularly, and we're delighted to have her with us tonight, especially as she is supposedly currently in Ireland carrying out external examining duties in Dublin, was there today and will be returning back to Dublin again tonight so she can carry on her examining duties in the morning. So as I said, we're delighted to have Sue here today to give the vote of thanks, particularly as she and Julie shared much in common, both in terms of the research interests, but they also had enormous respect for each other on a personal and scientific level. Sue, you're most welcome.
Myrtle, Gordon, Molly, Vice-Chancellor, Dean, Deputy Dean, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honour for me to be here to really wrap up and to give a vote of thanks to our 4 fantastic speakers, but also to put into perspective the research that Julie did and where it fits into the vitamin D world. And I said to Barbara when I was invited, I would fly if I had wings. But I didn't need to. Barbara sorted out my transport, and I bring with me the very best wishes from Dublin. They truly would love to have been here, and certainly have made sure to move all my timetables so that I could ensure that I'm here. I have a big box of marking to go back to, but I really am so honoured to give this closing part. And I want to say this, and that is, let us not be sad. It is a celebration of all that Julie did, and that work that she has done will be with us forever. And I think the legacy of the fantastic students that she has, and all the research publications that are there, that everybody is using, not just in the UK and Ireland, but worldwide. And so what I want to do in a very short space of time is really to just wrap up and put the vitamin D research into the global context. And in essence, as you've heard, vitamin D is a very special nutrient. There are not very many foods that contain vitamin D, and our main source is UVB exposure. And as somebody who's travelled up to Coleraine, I can say with great sincerity that there are sunny days, and I've enjoyed those enormously. And in essence, the best way of telling whether you are in the right sunshine is your shadow. And so when we move to the spring in April, when your shadow is shorter than your height is when you will be making some vitamin D. And so when you're out in that shadow, think of Julie in terms of the vitamin D that you will make when your shadow is shorter than your height. And obviously we're in the depths of winter at the moment, and so even on a sunny day, your shadow would be double your height. Now, as was very nicely put by the speakers, one of the key things that we have now is the new American publication on vitamin D requirements. These came out on the 30th of November in 2010, and Julie's work was very much there informing the American committees, and indeed a presentation was made by Cork and Coleraine at the American deliberations. And so what we now see is that we have vitamin D recommendations at about 600 international units, or 15 micrograms. It remains currently at 0 for the UK, and that was based on the premise or on the scientific thinking that you would make enough vitamin D during the summer that would last you during the winter. And it is Julie's work, along with others, that have shown that actually that scientific thinking is wrong. And so what is very important, and if we just go through, and I want to just pull in the presentations that we've heard, one of the key aspects of the presentation by Maria is, of course, Julie's group providing SACN with very key information about dietary intakes in Northern Ireland of vitamin D. And these will be very much used by SACN. I sit both on SACN main committee and on the vitamin D working group, and I thought when I was invited to apply that I was a little too high-spirited for SACN, in that I've been very outspoken, that we've been rather in the weeds with respect to not coming up with a vitamin D requirement. And I'm very pleased to say that I'm on there, and I can say, ladies and gentlemen, with absolute certainty how much Julie's work is hugely valued by that committee and by Dr. Anne Prentice, who is the chair, who of course also sends her very best wishes for this evening. And we have evidence that there is vitamin D deficiency, not only with the lovely data that we've heard, but this is the largest study. So these were men and women who were born in 1958, and you'll see where it's darker, you can see the greater the increase in vitamin D as you go north latitude. But as what is key in terms of the contribution of Maria's work is very much providing us with key data on the vitamin D status, and showing that we do have a very big problem in Northern Ireland of vitamin D deficiency. We then went on to hear from Eamon all the key work that he has been doing, and the methodological aspects of vitamin D are very problematic. It is a very difficult nutrient to measure, and many different laboratories have given different measurements. And so the reason that that makes it so complicated for us is, where do you draw that line? As Eamon said, if one laboratory is reading slightly low and one laboratory is reading slightly high, then it makes defining low vitamin D status very problematic. And certainly the work that Eamon presented is absolutely fundamental to giving us very big and very important comparisons between the different methodologies. And it is typical of Julie that she saw so much the importance, not just about measuring it in individuals, but making sure that the methods that you were using were absolutely spot on. And as you'll see here, as Eamon demonstrated, one lab against another lab can show very different results. And so we now know, and I think as time is going on and nutrition scientists are really shaping up, that we are in a much better place going forward as to where that line should be drawn. And certainly the Institute of Medicine in the US set their cutoff point of 50 nanomoles per litre. And then we look also to the lovely work that Valerie did with Julie, and the importance of vitamin D deficiency and highlighting that in pregnant women, because of course, ladies and gentlemen, if the mother is deficient of vitamin D, that's going to have a huge impact on the offspring. And so Julie's work wasn't just about measuring it in populations and using that to really help us define vitamin D requirements, also looking at it in terms of methods, but highlighting that absolute key stage in the unborn child's life. Because if the mother is not where she should be for her vitamin D, then it's not good for her offspring. And that was very important data that Valerie presented, both in terms of the numbers below 25, but also the numbers below 50. And that is really huge. And I think Julie's work has really tried to highlight that 10 microgram recommendation that is made by Sacken and formerly Coma before that, for people to really wake up and for health professionals to wake up to the fact that our pregnant women aren't perhaps taking those supplements as they should be. And then, of course, there are different sources of food. Not very many foods, but there are some, and this was alluded to very nicely, your eggs and your fish. Fish, for those of you who are interested, and I hope you're all going to think about vitamin D in probably a different way than you did before this talk. Your farmed fish has a much lower vitamin D content than your wild fish, and your free-range eggs are higher in vitamin D than your battery hen eggs. And if you're a mushroom lover, your button mushrooms do not contain any vitamin D2. It is only the wild mushroom. So when you're out shopping, think about that vitamin D in your shopping basket. And what's very key is that there is now a lot of interest about food fortification. And I'm not sure if that's going to be the recommendation of Sacken. Our publications will be really presented to government in 2014, but certainly there is a lot of government interest. We have some funding from the BBSRC to look at food fortification in a solid food, which is a biscuit, and a liquid food, which is a juice. But one of the most important vehicles is milk. And I can't say with more sincerity how important that this study was, or is, that Kirsty so nicely presented, and how Julie thought of vitamin D from all the different angles. And she was one step ahead of the game in terms of thinking of vehicles. Milk is probably the best vehicle of all, and really has been understudied, and it's lovely to see that that's going to follow through. So good luck with that, Kirsty, in taking it forward. And what we've done in terms of, you have differences in D2 and D3, and that is very much what the study that we've started at Surrey. And I remember sharing with Julie the controversy around D2 and D3, and so we published a meta-analysis, and Julie would have enjoyed enormously the controversy. Michael Hollick is a very big name in vitamin D, and he and I have had some very interesting tete-a-tetes at meetings, in that his two studies are the only two studies that say D2 and D3 are the same. And all the other studies say that D3 is better. And so we had the mindset to run an editorial and to run a meta-analysis on this in which we showed that D3 was better than D2. And I know Julie would have enjoyed enormously and probably would have said to me, send in the paper with your complimentary card. So I'm waiting for his lab to explode with regard to what we've shown. But Julie was always of that mindset to do things like that. And what I think is also very important in Kirsty's work that she presented is the importance of body size. So how critical is it that if you are a larger body size, how important is that to vitamin D deficiency? And we don't have anywhere near enough data on that. And again, this is very key data that SACN is currently using in thinking about its vitamin D requirements. One of the things that Julie and I often commented on was the fact that we yo-yo every year. Populations go up and down and up and down. And I think that study that Maria presented at the beginning has been absolutely fundamental. And I think the fact that it's been used by the Americans in their own setting of their RNIs and RDAs shows that actually wintertime supplementation may very well be the way to go. And it may be that actually rather than encouraging populations to supplement all through the year, Julie would often comment to me and say, actually, if you just supplemented in the winter, you would make this line go flat and we would no longer yo-yo. Whether that will actually end up happening, I'm not sure. But she, again, was really ahead of the game in her thinking. And then I think the other thing on closing, I remember sharing an idea that had spun out just from some conversations about the work, a lot of work that I do with the King Abdulaziz University in Saudi Arabia. And this was always Julie's thoughts. Pursue an opportunity or an idea, even if you're not sure where it's going. And I remember talking to her about this idea and saying to her, Julie, do you think they're all going to think I'm bonkers? And she's saying to me, not at all. And we just finished an analysis of vitamin D deficiency. This is based on 500 Saudi Arabian ladies. It's the hardest study I've ever done. It took me 6 months to get the samples out of Saudi Arabia to get them measured in a really good laboratory. But we found differences in vitamin D levels between those women who are fully vowed and those women who just wear the hijab. And so what we did was that we came up with this idea of actually one way that you could really help those Middle Eastern ladies would be to actually change the material that they use. And I remember sharing this with Julie and us laughing and saying that actually it may very well be the vanity of Western women, because this is a material, for example, that is UVB transparent. Now, the project has a long way to go yet, but I remember laughing with Julie and saying, gosh, they're all going to say this woman really is the nutty professor. And her saying to me, actually, pursue the idea even if it doesn't end anywhere. So watch this space. We've a long way to go yet. But I always smile when I remember Julie saying to me, gosh, the vanity of Western women may actually be the answer, or one of the answers for vitamin D deficiency in Middle Eastern women. And so I finish just to say how much there is an international flavour with that which is done, of the work that is done here in Niche. And I always sing Niche's praises and the University of Ulster at Coleraine and Sean Strain's leadership. You are really the top place in the United Kingdom for doing nutritional sciences research. We all know that. I'm not sure my VC at the University of Surrey would be too pleased that I was saying that, but I say it with great sincerity, and I think you really are a wonderful outfit. And although Julie is no longer here with you in person, she certainly is in spirit, and she would want you to really carry on the wonderful work that she did. So please don't be sad, as hard as that is. And then just to say, I cannot, as I've already indicated, say with more sincerity that her work is absolutely fundamental, not just to the UK SACN committee, but the worldwide vitamin D recommendations, its decisions and its deliberations. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Sue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my job now to bring this part of the proceedings to a conclusion. And I mean, I'd really like to thank Julie's family for making tonight happen. I mean, they agreed to allow us to honour Julie's work in this way. I'm sure it hasn't been an easy evening for them, and we appreciate them allowing us to go ahead with it in this way. And I'm sure you'll all agree that Molly has been fantastic. Hasn't she been really good? I mean, there's none of us here who wanted tonight to be like this. You know, we all wanted it to be so different, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. I would also like to pay tribute to all of the speakers. I appreciate only too well the bittersweetness of the task that you had, and I think you really delivered it in such an excellent way, and I'm sure Julie would have been very proud of your contributions. Sue was saying that she hoped that we'd all take away something tonight about vitamin D. Well, to be honest with you, I'm hoping the Vice-Chancellor's taking something away. Now, didn't you see how bad it is if you live and work in Coleraine? So I'm sure you'll organise for us to have longer time off during the summer. I mean, we really need to go somewhere and get some rays. I think that's the thing to do. I would like, nonetheless, to thank the colleagues from the Vice-Chancellor's office for their organisation of the event tonight, for catering, which you're about to experience and hopefully enjoy, and security staff who've made tonight possible. And perhaps just in conclusion, I could ask you to join me in showing our appreciation and in recognising the truly excellent scientific contributions of Professor Julie Wallace.